Hello and welcome to Counter Culture. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, here we are on Friday morning. Yesterday was so-called Super Thursday, many elections taking place, obviously for the Scottish Assembly, Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, and in London, and all around the country too. But I think that what a lot of people will be thinking of is what are the implications for the union? Because, of course, this is something which is very much to the forefront of the news at the moment. We're going to be looking at what these elections might mean for the union and also what is the lookout for it in the short and the long term. So with me to discuss this, I'm very pleased we have Leo Kearse, who is standing in Scotland, in Glasgow, for the Reclaim Party, Henry Hill, who is the news editor for Conservative Home, and Graham Stewart, who is Deputy Editor of the Critic and a Senior Fellow at Buckingham University. Can I start by asking you, Henry, just a bit of useless speculation here, but what do you think, how do you think the land is going to lie after we know the results of these elections? Particularly I'm thinking of Scotland here, and indeed, they're going to be coming in over the weekend, aren't they?
Yeah, so the two that I'm really looking at for Conservative Home are Scotland and Wales, and I think they're both very interesting elections. Obviously, no journalist wants to be speculating about the results for a show that's going to go out after they've started to come in, but nonetheless, most of the polls show that the SNP are on the cusp of an overall majority. Some polls show them a few seats above, some polls show them a few seats below. Now, in the last election, they actually underperformed all of their polling. And if that happened again, they would not receive an overall majority, which would be fantastic news for unionists. But as it is, it looks like they're on the cusp. What that does mean is that when you add in the votes of the Scottish Greens, who look like they're going to have a very good election and are also pro-independence, there's going to be almost certainly a pro-independence majority in the next Scottish Parliament. Now, we're in this actually quite strange position where the Scottish Conservatives have been desperately playing up the threat of an independence referendum to try and get their voters out and hold second place against Labour. Whilst the SNP, perhaps looking at polling showing support for independence going down and support for holding a referendum going down, have been working very hard to get independence off their ballot papers. They decided not to put for a second independence referendum or whatever they were going to put on their regional ballot papers, which they originally were planning to do. They've largely removed it from their literature. So I think that the Prime Minister will be in a fairly strong position after these results come in to do what he said he was going to do, which is to say that regardless of the result, we had a referendum in 2014. We have only just left the European Union. We're in the middle of a pandemic. It is important to respect the result of the 2014 referendum and not treat it as some kind of 5-yearly ephemeral thing, and therefore refuse to grant a Section 30 order that would be needed to hold a legal referendum. Now, it might be that the SNP then push for an illegal referendum or a so-called consultative referendum. I personally don't think Nicola Sturgeon will do that because it would be very unpopular. So I think actually the government will be in a fairly strong position as long as it holds its nerve. But I think another interesting one, which I just want to mention quickly, is Wales, because in Wales, it looks like a very interesting change is happening, which is that a party called Abolish the Welsh Assembly Party, which, as the name suggests, is anti-devolution, at the current polling is looking like it's going to pick up 4 or 5 seats, possibly whilst the Liberal Democrats get wiped out. And the result of that is that actually the next Welsh Parliament might end up in a situation where it's completely polarised around the constitution, with Labour only able to hold office as a result of a deal with Plaid Cymru, the Welsh nationalists, and the Tories can only really do a deal with Abolish, because if they do a deal with Plaid Cymru to get Labour out, Abolish will eat up their sort of anti-devolution votes. So I think in both cases, we're looking at a situation where the constitution, for better or worse, is going to be centre stage over the next 5 years.
That's extraordinary, is it not, in Wales, actually, Henry? You talk about the Abolish. They've been going for, what is it, about a year?
Yeah, so they've officially been going since about 2015. But basically what happened is at the last Welsh elections, UKIP picked up 7 seats. And they did this whilst the Tories held most of theirs. So what that really represented was a new, if you like, sort of right-wing space opening up in Welsh politics that the Tories hadn't been able to tap into. Now, obviously, after Brexit, the energy sort of went out of UKIP. Their MPs and all went in different directions. And 3 of them have ended up, including Mark Reckless, have ended up in Abolish. Now, they're just quite fortunate. They've got a very simple message. They've got a platform, and they've got a constituency. There's hundreds of, if you look at compare the results of devolved elections to Westminster elections in Wales. Hundreds of thousands of voters, Tory voters, all of them, turn out for Westminster and for local government elections, but ignore Senate elections. There is a big Devo-sceptic constituency in Wales, and they're tapping into it. And I think that actually Douglas Ross, as leader of the Scottish Conservatives, is going to be casting a nervous eye at what's happening in Wales, because polling suggests that while there's not as well developed an anti-devolution movement in Scotland as there is in Wales at the moment, a majority of Scottish Conservative voters would vote to get rid of the Scottish Parliament if they had the chance. And there's a danger that a party, Abolish Holyrood, are running in this election. They've got the top spot on the regional ballot paper for sort of alphabetical reasons. And there's danger that if a party could come in and start pitching to those voters and start eating into Douglas Ross's vote as well.
I see. Leo, can you explain to me, because it'd be good to know where you're coming from. What exactly is your platform as a reclaimed candidate there?
So I'm running on a single issue platform pretty much. So it's to repeal the hate crime bill. Basically, Humza Yousaf, the SNP's Justice Minister, brought through this. It's a terrible, pernicious bit of legislation. It's really vaguely worded. It could make comedy illegal. It can make private conversations in your own home illegal. So, if you crack a joke in front of your child repeats it in school, your child can be interrogated by the police and forced to testify against you. And it'll mainly be used maliciously. In my experience, people use it to get over. Like my girlfriend's friend has reported 2 hate crimes against her ex-boyfriend purely maliciously to get at him. So I mean, it's terrible legislation, and it's sort of leading the way that they're doing a sort of review of the Equalities Act in the UK, so the SNP are sort of leading the way on that. But the SNP all the way through, they've used sort of wokeism, if we can call it that, as a sort of cover for their to pursue their own ends. So under Me Too, they changed the ministerial code to prosecute Alex Salmond. If he's to be believed, it was almost if you listen to Alex Salmond, it was a conspiracy. And then they've accused enemies of Sturgeon of transphobia to sack them. So Joanna Cherry was accused of transphobia and sacked and replaced with somebody more pals with Sturgeon. So this legislation they bring through is always used for sort of nefarious means, even though it sounds like it's just being used to make the world a better place.
But Leo, before we go on, what is your position on future referendums in Scotland? I mean, what is your position vis-a-vis Scottish nationalism?
Well, I mean, I do disagree with you a bit, because I think Sturgeon will push for independence sooner rather than later. Because at the moment, the SNP have been in power for 14 years. They're a tired government with all this sort of corruption and pitfalls and laziness and coming apart at the seams of any sort of 14-year-old regime. So she's aware of that. And she's spent they've spent the last 14 years, well, before that as well, whipping up this nationalist fervour. And for some reason, Scottish nationalism isn't scrutinised and criticised the same way that English nationalism is. The BNP, everybody thinks that they're terrible. The SNP, everybody thinks that they're wonderful. And I don't know why. I think it's because, they're seen as fighting back against English oppressors, and, England's the straight white man of countries. But also Alex Salmond's return to the political fray, even though he doesn't have a lot of support, he's very he's agitating for a quick independence, almost a sort of Catalonian separatism. And also at the moment they've got the perfect storm. They've just come out of coronavirus, which, despite the facts, Sturgeon's seen as handled well and Westminster is seen as handled badly. We've got an unpopular Tory government, and we've got Brexit, which is at the moment is seen as mainly a bad thing, particularly in Scotland. So we've got the perfect storm right now to sort of push for independence, and I think it'd be a terrible shame. However bad Brexit is for British trade, Scotland leaving the UK, Scotland does 62% of its trade with the UK. It would be an economic disaster for Scotland, and it's not as if Scotland's a particularly rich country that can has the capacity to deal with economic disasters.
Yeah, Graham, why do you think it is, as Leo says there, that the SNP, and he says it's given a bit of a free ride? I mean, would you agree with that?
The Scottish National Party finds itself in a very useful position for itself thanks to devolution. On the one hand, it is the party of government. On the other hand, it's a party of opposition to the UK government, or as it is now positioning itself in this particular election, the party against Boris Johnson. This is a very personalised campaign the SNP are running, personalised in the sense of promoting Nicola Sturgeon as the Mother Teresa figure who saved Scotland from coronavirus, and at the same time saved Scotland from bumbling Boris, as he is relentlessly portrayed throughout Scotland. So this ability that devolution gives the SNP to appear to be an insurgent force fighting against a stronger force, which is in some mystical way holding Scotland down, is incredibly helpful. I mean, it's true that at one level this SNP government is coming away at the seams, but it's coming away at the seams, but still going to get roughly about 50% of the vote at the constituency level, despite having been in power for 14 years. That's an extraordinary political achievement.
Is there this distinction to be made, is there not, between people who support the SNP and also people who support independence, which is actually gone down a little bit, hasn't it? I mean, can you support the SNP without wanting independence?
Yes, you can, and there are a lot of former Scottish Labour voters who have defected to the SNP. There are a variety of reasons for that. Some of them are not dissimilar to the way in which voters in Northern Ireland from the nationalist community used to vote SDLP and then realised that Sinn Féin had become the stronger horse to back for their community. It feels something similar since the 2014 referendum in Scotland, that the SNP is seen as the stronger horse for Scotland, and the Scottish Labour is a broken reed. Extraordinary to think so when you think how much Scottish Labour used to dominate the political scene. I grew up in Scotland, and Labour was by a country mile the predominant force in Scotland. Now it looks like it may struggle to be the second party, probably the third party, narrowly behind the Scottish Conservatives, both in the popular vote and in terms of seats that are actually returned. Isn't
it right actually that nationally, if you're still talking nationally as we are at the moment, that basically Labour cannot win? Is this right, Henry, if it without this sort of Scottish support that it always once took for granted? Isn't that right?
It certainly becomes an awful lot harder. They've really been hit by a double whammy because the Conservatives are making huge inroads into their sort of old redoubts in the Midlands and Northern England, and then they've had this complete collapse in Scotland. And there are little bits that could offset this in time. The Tories are getting less and less competitive in London, and that opens up more seats, but not nearly enough seats. So yes, Labour. The big strategic challenge facing Labour at the moment is that they've got so many different things to try and stitch together their coalition. They've got to be, if they make too many concessions to Scottish voters, and unfortunately Labour's stuck in this sort of one-track devolutionary mindset they've been stuck in since the mid-1990s, where the only thing they can think of when it comes to Scotland is more powers, more money, more federalism. But if they do that too much, then voters in English constituencies are going to notice, and they don't like that. And the Conservatives have already proven very adept at highlighting the risk of Labour being in hock, if you like, to the Scottish National Party or to those sort of interests. And so they really are in a bind. But yes, if they can't win back Scotland, then their mission in England becomes even harder, and they need to reach even farther into places that have traditionally voted Conservative than they ever have, really.
Can I ask, whoever wants to answer me here, but what do you think, how strong do you think is the will generally to keep this union together? How strong is it?
I think there is a considerable will. I mean, the question starts by asking, where is the will?
Yes.
That there is will in Whitehall. Boris Johnson is a unionist. He's no desire to go down as the Prime Minister who lost the United Kingdom, and that is what we're effectively talking about if Scotland leaves. There is obviously considerable will amongst other leading figures in Whitehall, and in Michael Gove we have someone who's pursued some interesting policies towards the union, not least in terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol, but someone who certainly would define himself as a unionist. There have been various iterations of units in Whitehall. I've forgotten what number of iteration we're on at the moment to look at the union, but I mean, it can't just be left to one minister and a group of like-minded advisors around him. The Scottish National Party is in government. It is effectively a civil service that is working day and night to look at things from an entirely Scottish perspective, and a large part of which is sympathetic towards the goals of the Scottish National Party. Until Whitehall looks root and branch in every possible way about preserving the Union, they're not even in the same game as the Scottish Nationalists.
I think. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go on, Henry.
I think that the problem is that actually post Brexit we have seen is that the will has been lacking in places where we really needed it. You know, there's been this unfortunate phenomenon where some people who supported the Remain campaign and sort of argued seemingly very passionately in the run-up to the referendum that a vote for a Remain vote was necessary to save the Union, seem now almost sort of welcome the prospect of Scottish independence on the basis that it would provide them with the mother of all I told you so's to Brexiteers. And so there's less elite buy-in for the Union than we might expect. And the other problem is that we found out that actually, as I mentioned earlier, that Labour are stuck on this kind of one-track, pro-devolution mindset that basically they can't admit they got it wrong in 1998 and they need it to be correct. This actually extends deep into officialdom. There's been a trend recently of people who previously held senior official positions, so they weren't politicians, but senior official positions in the civil service with respect to union-related areas, so go retiring and then coming back as great thinkers on the Constitution. And the attitudes they reveal are really extraordinary. Kieran Martin, who was one of the lead officials, if not the lead official, on the UK government side in negotiating with Alex Salmond for the terms of the original Scottish referendum, has come out and basically said that actually he thinks that the Union, if the Union is meant to be voluntary, then it should be up for debate every 5 years of the SNP win a majority, which is an extraordinary thing to say. Whilst the head of the former head of the Scottish office wrote a piece for the Times this week or last week saying that he wants to save the Union, in his words, by reducing the ambit of Westminster to defence and the currency and devolving absolutely everything else. So actually what we're seeing from the government is a long overdue reassessment from political unionism about what saving the country actually involves. And that's why we've had stuff like the UK Internal Market Act. It's why ministers are already talking about UKIM 2. It's about why we're talking about expanding Westminster's authority in the devolved territories. And that's really helpful. But the official, they're building on weak foundations because the official attitudes in so much of Whitehall are those they inherited from New Labour.
I have to say, I mean, I asked, how strong the will is. I don't think you remember earlier, but when we had the referendum campaign last time, it was incredibly lackluster on the part of the unionists, was it not? I mean, I seem to remember it was not exactly apologetic, but their heart wasn't in it. Yeah,
almost like the Remain campaign. I think this time round it'll be a lot fiercer because it's much more of a sort of tangible threat. The dissolution of the union could be just around the corner. And what I'm seeing in Scotland is the sectarian divisions, which have sort of simmered down for so long, they're starting to flare up again because of this threat. So the unionists are becoming more bombastic, more louder and more strident. But the nationalists are definitely becoming, they seem much more empowered, and there's no. There doesn't seem to be a check on them. I mean, there were Scottish nationalists at the border with England screaming at English cars to F off back down to England. And it took Sturgeon 48 hours to tell them off. And, I mean, you can imagine if somebody was, if English nationalists were at the border with Dover shouting at ferries coming over, they'd be denounced immediately and, labelled pariahs. So I think the sectarian divisions, which I remember in the 90s, university in Scotland, we were genuinely worried that Scotland could split like Yugoslavia did, because I mean they're running battles and people getting stabbed over these sectarian divisions, so Protestant and Unionist versus Catholic and nationalist. And I think this, with the real threat of Scotland leaving the UK, this is going to become a lot more tense and a lot fierier.
It's interesting, isn't it, that here we have in this election campaign for the Holyrood Parliament Boris Johnson has not set foot in Scotland.
No.
And I mean, he will have been encouraged not to attend, encouraged not least by Douglas Ross, the Scottish Conservative leader, who has spent much of his time as leader trying to distance himself as much as possible from Boris Johnson. Now,
although Boris, according to a poll out today, Boris actually has a higher net approval rating than Douglas Ross does.
That's right, but Boris is, I think, on 27%, and Douglas Ross is on 18%. So, I think Douglas Ross is a bit of a case of physician, heal thyself here.
Yes.
But it's also, it's not great when you're a unionist party who basically treats the other parts of the United Kingdom as off limits. You can't come to Scotland. It's effectively treating Scotland as if it's already an independent country. And that's deeply unhelpful.
Do you recognise the picture that was being painted there by Leo, the rise in sectarianism? Does that ring true to you too?
Well, sectarianism has been a long-term problem in Scotland. I mean, that's not new. And I mean, if you go back to the origins of the Scottish National Party, it was actually quite a sectarian party which treated Scottish Labour as a Catholic party, and the SNP were a Protestant party which also had some other interesting views in the 1940s, which you won't read about.
Interesting. That is a nice way of putting it.
A lot of that sectarian feeling has now translated itself into an anti-English feeling. It's interesting that it's an anti-English feeling. We're dealing here about the breakup of the UK. What was focused very strongly on the situation in Northern Ireland, which gave the sectarianism its edge in Scotland, particularly in Glasgow and the West Coast, that has now been sidelined away to focus on England, or more specifically London or Westminster. They don't really have a problem with Geordies or Mancunians. They're focusing against what they see as feet-rich people in the southeast.
Yes. You know that when originally Blair set devolution into motion, although as I understand it, it was in fact a policy that had been put in place by John Smith, if this is right, but that Blair carried it on. It was a huge, wasn't it? Disaster. It's achieved exactly the opposite of what it was meant to, which was take the steam out the whole thing. You quite often hear now, don't you, that why can't England have its own assembly, right? If that were to be introduced into the mix, that would be the end of things entirely, would it not? Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. An English Parliament, from the perspective of someone who wants to keep the UK together, an English Parliament is absolutely the worst possible option. It's basically the outcome of sort of magical thinking, because if you think about it logically, and you accept the Diva Skeptic case. The Diva Skeptic case, very simply, is that the devolved assemblies have created these classes of politicians who might, call divocrats, who have every incentive to blame the UK for their shortcomings and demand more money. And that's what they do. And that's what they've done for 20 years. And it's weakened the UK. So creating an English Parliament will just do exactly the same thing. It will create a few hundred new legislators. It will create a First Minister who will be almost as prominent, if not more prominent, than the Prime Minister. And he will do exactly the same thing. He or she will blame Westminster for their problems, and they will demand more money and power. And it's actually even more dangerous because, at least, for all that we may dislike the fact that the union is currently so mercenary, at least in Scotland and Wales, pro-union politicians, even if they are very pro-devolution, they can say, right, we're receiving fiscal transfers from the rest of the United Kingdom. That's important. But if you're an English First Minister, money's leaving. Money's going out for Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, and you've got every incentive to run on the basis of why don't we keep English money in England? Yeah. And the moment you currently English nationalism is really a very latent sort of force. It's not organised, it's not properly expressed, it doesn't really shape the top echelons of politics much at all. But if you gave English nationalism institutional expression in an English Parliament, one, it would make Westminster almost useless, but two, it would break up the UK. There's no precedent for any kind of system where one federal unit was that big.
Yes, I heard there used to be sort of ideas when the idea of an English Assembly, English Parliament knocking about, the idea was to get rid of the Lords and basically that the English Parliament would sit in what was once the House of Lords, which is obviously very aesthetically pleasing, if nothing else. But the thing is, what is interesting is this week, William Hague, wrote a piece in the Times, and he was saying, and I think it's a very good, very nuanced piece until he got to the end, but he was basically saying, look, if we are going to survive as a union, we have to have a shared British identity again. This is basically gone because we've neglected it and what have you. And I wonder what you thought of this, because he put forward his idea for the basis of such an identity in the future would be much improved education for everybody, a much stronger emphasis on environmental issues, and indeed a sense of citizenship which saw expression in like citizen reserves, sort of like volunteer forces. Now, what do you think of that as a basis for British identity? Can I ask you,
I don't think anyone in Scotland who is a nationalist because of or would cease to be a nationalist if there was more focus on education, if there was more focus on environmentalism. Yeah. These may be fine things in themselves. They are essentially irrelevant to the unity of the United Kingdom. It's a mistake, incidentally, to think that unions break up primarily over economic considerations, including where resources go within the union. Overwhelmingly, if you look at the breakup of unified nations historically, they have broken up over cultural or ethnic reasons. They do not break up because of how certain resources are spread around them. I mean, just off the top of my head, Norway and its union with Sweden had absolutely nothing to do with the economics of the matter, and nor did the creation of the Irish Free State in Ireland, for that matter. It was not primarily about such considerations. So, I mean, William Hague is certainly right in the sense of we must focus on trying to find what bonds us together. I'm not sure what he's identified really ticks those boxes. And as for volunteerism, well, I mean, there are any number of very fine voluntary organisations at the moment where we could soup up a Duke of Edinburgh's award if we so wished and do something which was inspired from that, which might be a fine thing to do. It's not going to save the union.
No, would you agree with that, Leo? I mean, to me it seemed extraordinarily weak. I mean, almost to the point that they have no solutions. Basically what they're saying, we have no solution. We don't know, basically. We don't know what an identity should be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one because, I think education could be part of the solution. If you taught economics, basic economics in schools, then you realise that getting £14 billion a year from the UK is actually a pretty sweet deal. I think the SNP have been very clever in stopping the flow of people between Scotland and England to sort of foment the nationalism. So they subsidise university courses in Scotland for Scottish people. So if you stay in Scotland and study instead of coming down to London to study, you get it for free. So that stopped young people going down, and they see because of that they see the SNP as this benevolent force giving them all this education for free, but they're also not going down and meeting English people and seeing that English people are pretty much the same as Scottish people. And I think it's a real shame. I mean, look at it. One thing that devolution did was, ostensibly it's there to give Scotland more say in its own affairs, but it gave Scotland less say in the UK's affairs because we don't have, look at the great Scottish politicians of the past. I mean, Tony Blair, John Smith, and some not so good ones like Gordon Brown. But at one point, I worked in policing and government in London, and the place was full of Scots. We're all through the military, the civil service, and now we're sort of losing that because we're becoming this parochial, inward-looking country, which is quite sad. So I think if we increase the sort of flow of people over the border, then that would improve things.
The separate education policies and institutions is a very strong point. Even going back to my day when I was at school, which is, needless to say, not in this century, but even then, in my class at school in Edinburgh, about 2 or 3 clever clogs went to Cambridge. Everyone else went to a Scottish university. No one went to the other good English universities. No one even contemplated doing it. That isn't new. The different funding formulas have worsened it, but it's not new. And talk that the new Turing scheme might do something to advance the fluidity of movement between Scottish students and the rest of the UK is something which I think would be well worth addressing.
It would be worth addressing, but I do think your point is a very important one about things don't break up because of economics. We even saw this in an odd way with the Brexit vote, did we not? I mean, our political class still has never quite got its head around the fact that a lot of the reason people voted the way they did was cultural reasons, for better or worse. They still think it's about economics. I mean, Henry, why can't we? What is stopping us actually just making the case, should we wish to, that this has been a most extraordinary successful union? Why is it so difficult to make that case in our culture now?
I mean, I've always argued, and I think this is something that unionists are slowly coming around to, that you can't defend the union as a sort of construct without defending the British nation as the foundations of it, because you can't have, you're right, we talk about economics, but you can't have fiscal transfers. You won't maintain consent for fiscal transfers if you don't have a shared underlying identity. Because eventually, Europe's seeing this all the time, right? Every time they try to sort out the basic economic functions of the European Union, they run up against the fact that people in Northern Europe don't want to send money to people in Southern Europe and vice versa because they don't feel the same. So we do need a culture. The reason that making a cultural case is so difficult, despite the extraordinary achievements that the United Kingdom has achieved over the past few hundred years, is because such a case, it can't work from nothing. It needs to speak to something that people already see in their day-to-day lives. And I think that the big problem, and while William Hague's solutions weren't maybe the best, I think it's great that the government is sort of fumbling its way towards this line of reasoning, is that you need people in Scotland and Wales, before they can feel attached to a grand story about the union, they need to see the union doing stuff for them in their day-to-day lives. And the problem is that ever since devolution, whole areas of policy, and the areas of policy that people most care about, education and health and so on, are completely devolved. So that means, for example, if you live in North Wales and your NHS trust has been in special measures for 6 years, the union hasn't done anything about that. If you live in Scotland and you're watching children from underprivileged backgrounds fail to get into university because the SNP are maintaining a fees regime that favours subsidising middle-class pupils, the union hasn't done anything about that. So we do need to see far more institutional ways of making the British state more visible and more positively visible in Scotland and moving people around. Now, I think there are several ways you can do this. One, you could offer a scholarship that helps sort of underprivileged Scottish peoples who don't get into free spaces at Scottish unis to study elsewhere in the United Kingdom. William Hague talks about the NHS reserves. Now, obviously, that's not going to appeal to the more free market-minded types, but the NHS is one of the most important institutions binding us together. And I think that it would potentially be interesting, for example, if you had the NHS reserves organised on a UK-wide basis so that people who signed up could end up volunteering in hospitals all around the country. But you need to put in that work. You need to lay those foundations so that when you go to people in a referendum, which I hope we never have again, but if we do have one, and you say, yes, this United Kingdom is brilliant, it's achieved so much, they can go, oh yeah, no, it gave my son the opportunity to study that he wouldn't otherwise have had. It fixed this or that. It needs to speak to real experiences that they've already have. You can't make a positive case for a union that doesn't do anything except give money to ministers in Edinburgh and Cardiff.
Also, isn't one of the main problems that would, given, despite your constructive suggestions there, Henry, the problem surely is that this assault that we've seen on our national identity, if you like, or our history, over the past year, that has come from the institutions and from outside and all over. It is essentially aimed against Britain, isn't it? Britishness. It's not actually English or Scotland. It's this is the terrible thing that you have done here. This is the terrible thing you did here. Would you say that is the problem, one of the problems?
Well, I mean, the problem predates the recent culture wars, but nevertheless, the acid which is in recent months, in the last 2 or 3 years, being allowed to seep into the notion of British heritage and identity, the idea that our civilization is entirely built upon slavery, that almost everything that happened in the past was exploitative, is, as you rightly say, directed against an idea of Britishness. The Scots were just as involved, in fact, proportionally more so, as were the Irish, in building the British Empire as the English. They've got suddenly pretended it was somehow nothing to do with them, quite extraordinarily. We're just going to see this intensify unless we have a positive sense of British identity. It's a very difficult sell. And one thing that's particularly interesting about the polling that's being done in Scotland is the age demographic of support for nationalism. Amongst under 24-year-olds, support for Scottish nationalism, for Scottish independence, is at almost 80%.
80? Almost
80%. That is we're always led to believe younger people are more internationalist minded. Well, not in Scotland.
Yes, but you're laughing with a sort of sense of familiarity on your face there, Leo.
Yeah, although I would say that, Brexit has been a huge issue for young people in Scotland, so they are still internationally minded in terms of being part of Europe. I just don't think they've thought out, would Scotland get into Europe, and how would it actually work with a hard border with England and a separate currency and all the rest of it?
It's curious though, isn't it? I mean, they say they're still, into Europe. They just don't want to share the island they're on with their fellow Europeans.
Yes,
so,
yes.
I mean, it's a rather curious. A rather curious position to take. The polling, though, is also interesting. I mean, there's no doubt that Brexit has been a net negative in terms of Scottish perceptions of their place in the United Kingdom. But the polling doesn't really show that perception out. The rise in support for Scottish independence went down after the EU referendum. It's only really started to accelerate in 2019. And the reasons for that are, it's partly a dislike of the success of Boris Johnson's Conservative Party. The bigger the majority he secured, the more I think that made many Scots uneasy. And also a sense that a perception, which I think is a misperception, that Nicola Sturgeon has handled the COVID crisis in Scotland incredibly well. And we will see over time whether that perception is moderated by a longer perspective or not. But it's still worth remembering that almost 4 in 10 Scots voted to leave the European Union. So a clear minority, but not an irrelevant minority. One of the failings of the Scottish Conservative Party is that it's failed to embrace those Brexiteers. In fact, it treats them as an embarrassment, and I think
one of the problems with Scottish politics more generally is, and indeed Welsh politics, is the fact that there's not enough political diversity. Both Edinburgh and Cardiff have quite narrow political cultures with very strong consensus which exclude all of this. If you were just following the Welsh leaders during the EU referendum, when Carwyn Jones was writing dire warnings in national newspapers about how a Leave vote would force Wales to choose which but Wales voted Leave. Yeah. Did any senior Welsh politician suggest that Wales would vote Leave? No. And likewise in Scotland, how many MSPs, MPs, newspaper columnists, think tanks in Scotland represented Leave and advocated Leave to Scottish voters? It wasn't 4 in 10 or however many Scots voted Leave. Yeah. So they've been let down consistently on a range of issues by the fact that their views are just not represented at the official level.
Can I just to finish up, just to speculate idly, here we are, 2021. Do you think that in 2031 we will still be United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland? Henry?
Who's that? Yes, I do. I think that the government is going to, I can give you a timeline if you want, basically. I think the government's going to refuse a referendum in this parliament because it has no incentive to grant one. I think that by the time we get to the next parliament, we're at 2025. The SNP, who are already struggling a bit, have been in power even longer. Nicola Sturgeon's political career is nearing its end and they don't have a talent to replace her. And the trade-off for Brexit is that whilst it's made sort of the emotional appeal of leaving the UK stronger for a section of 2014 no voters who voted Remain, it's made the practical difficulties of Scottish independence much, much harder. And this was something I think Remain campaigners didn't really confront during the referendum. You know, if we are both members of the European Union, that sets a very, very high floor for Anglo-Scottish relations in the event of the breakup of the UK. You know, they can write off all kinds of economic and border issues and just say, no, we're both members of the European Union. Now, they have to make a really hard choice if they leave. And they have to make a choice that could involve, for example, middle-class Scots having to pay their mortgages in pound sterling whilst receiving their pay packets in the Scots pound, and all of this kind of thing. So I actually think that whilst it's a bit bleak and the SNP are still very strong, the union's position over the short to medium term is actually a lot stronger than most people think.
Leo, 10 years time?
I think in 10 years' time the UK will be together, but I think it'll be after Scotland leaving and then asking to get back in again.
Okay. How about you?
Well, I mean, if Scotland did leave, they would never be granted. A Scottish government would never grant them another referendum. They want referendums until they get the result they want. Then there will never be another referendum permitted again. I am confident that with sufficient resolve, that we are at peak NAT at the moment, and if we hold fast, the case for the union is strong, but it needs a stronger way to express it.
Perfect. Well, look, thank you very, very much indeed, Graham. Thank you, Leo. Thank you, Henry, for that. And we shall see what the election results yield anyway this weekend. Thank you for watching Counterculture, and we shall see you next time. Bye-bye.